Hi, everyone, and welcome to the SRHM podcast, which explores new research and emerging trends in the field of sexual and reproductive health and rights, with a focus on using rights-based knowledge for action.
Hello for everyone. I'm Eszter Kismődi, Chief Executive of Sexual and Reproductive Health Matters, and I warmly welcome today Jamie Vernaelde, who is the Senior Researcher at Ipas. Welcome, Jamie, here at the SRHM podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So today we are talking about an Ipas report on future-proofing the professionalization of an anti-rights youth generation. As you point out in your introduction, the report talks about how the anti-rights movement has worked with youth and introduces that how it actually seeds. This is a seed of the extremist ideologies into future generations. You are pointing out that we are at a critical juncture, and for us, the struggle is both personal and political. And you point out that we must disrupt, we must challenge, and we must build a movement with the same patience, strategy, and foresight. But, and it's very important, that is distinguishing with the anti-rights movement, that it's rooted in justice, freedom, and equality. Can you please provide us an introduction to the report? What made you write, research, and analyze this movement and make this report?
Yeah, thanks again for the introduction and the opportunity to be here to talk about this report with its long title and 80 pages. So Ipas has, for the last 15 to 20 years, looked at the anti-rights movement rather broadly. For those of you who don't know, Ipas is a reproductive justice organization. We work across the world trying to guarantee the right to bodily autonomy, including SRHR, sexual and reproductive health and rights, and abortion rights. A big part of our work is understanding what the ecosystem for that looks like and the opposition to it. And so naturally, to a certain extent, we follow the groups, the movements, the individuals who are working against the full spectrum and enjoyment of human rights. And we found ourselves in the last really, I would say, 5 to 7 years, seeing more and more young people in spaces where we do human rights advocacy, like at the Commission on the Status of Women, coming with known anti-rights, anti-abortion, anti-LGBTQ actors from not just the US, but from Mexico, from certain other countries in Europe and in Africa. And we were just wondering, why are these very polished young people accompanying some people who are literally spewing hate speech and, to a certain, almost violence against certain groups on certain rights? And so that's really of why are they here? How did they get here? And why are we seeing them more and more in these spaces?
So I would like to go with you chapter by chapter of this report and engage with the details and encourage the readers, listeners to go to the report and go into details, because it is really engages us to think, reflect, and strategize, as you pointed out. Your first chapter starts and calls with the inception. And you point out that the anti-rights movement treats young people as a cohort whose education must be molded to develop and harness as a potential force to achieve their long-term goals. So where the conception, the inception of its movement started?
Yeah, and I think we can look to, many groups, many religions that work with education as a way of building societies. Working with young people is not new by any means, nor is educating them in specific doctrines and faiths and issues. None of that is new. What we were finding was, especially in the US, there was the bringing together of this element of wanting to control young people's education and we look back some 100 years to key court cases in the US, but also with the rise of organizing politically around not just Catholicism and the religious, what eventually becomes the religious right, and how both this political organization of religious groups in the US, again, mostly evangelical and Catholic, happens at the same time as this harnessing of young people through education, through targeted programs, and through specific organizations to bring them together. Again, it's interesting if you look back, and I'm speaking about the US knowing, we could speak about, Catholic recruitment of young people through education. Again, nothing new there. You've had schools go hand in hand with religious institutions for millennia at this point. But specifically in the US, you had the formation. I don't want to go too into the details, but there was a trial in the early 1920s that looked at education and teaching actually evolution. And that was a really galvanizing moment for the evangelicals who were against the teaching of evolution in school. And what came out of that was a politicization of evangelicals specifically. You had Catholic and other, and again, across the world, involvement in politics to a certain extent. But in the US, there was really a separation of political involvement, specifically from the evangelical group. And because of this trial, which they actually won, but the backlash in the media, you had these groups starting to create what we call parachurch organizations, which is separate, not always, of course, anti-rights or the rest, but basically these groups that were coming together to influence different parts of society, whether that was politics, culture, again, education, but those groups going hand in hand with this desire to politicize and to really control education. And when we talk about later the religious rights, that's where you bring in Roe v. Wade, which was originally mostly fought by Catholic groups, but evangelical groups saw that as an opportunity to also align their causes. And with that alignment comes the recruitment of young people by those different groups into the movement that became really the anti-abortion, anti-Roe movement in the US in the 1970s.
You also mentioned the conservative movement, for example, in Brazil and Latin America and Europe. So how the two links together, or the several movements in that insertion phase or early phase?
Again, we talk about sort of these parachurch organizations or other movements. As you mentioned, in Brazil, it's tradition, family, and property, who have, again, the name says it all, their most valued issues. A Catholic group that worked, again, through schools starting in Brazil, but then also gained movement and now is a global movement. And we can also talk about Ordo Iuris, whose roots are very much another organization that is affiliated with the Catholic Church and got its start again through recruitment at university levels. So you have these different things happening. And the reason why we focus on the US is that there was really this desire to use, at the time, technology, radio, eventually television, to specifically target and evangelize and recruit young people. And these youth-led organizations, or seemingly youth-led organizations, that got young people involved in an issue and gave them a very concrete in-group. That had also, at the time, again, not all these groups are anti-rights, but what happened is using these different educational formats, these different, we talk about mission trips a lot in the US, and it's happening all over the world. You gave young people a cause, and then that drive and that method for recruitment was paired with eventually anti-abortion, anti-gender, and anti-LGBTQ rhetoric as well.
And then you are talking about political awakening, and you use the phrase boots on the ground. The report says the U.S. Christian rights focus and recruitment of young people through ministries, campus groups, and other youth-targeted outreach paved the way for what has since become a highly successful mobilization tactic for the more encompassing religious right marches. Can you talk about the relevance of these marches?
Yeah, and again, if we think about sort of distinct groups, I mentioned, parts of the Catholic Church in the US were very much against Roe v. Wade, and originally the pro-life movement was a Catholic movement. But because you had this separate evangelical political awakening or drive, they came together. And so that's where you get exactly what you mentioned. A March for Life is so emblematic of giving it's the pro-life movement, the anti-abortion movement very much gave a backbone, a structure for mobilizing young people through the church, through parachurch organizations like campus groups at the university level, but even younger. And so then you had, the first marches for life in the 1970s and 80s, especially at the end of the 80s. And largely those were recruited from young people. And again, now the March for Life is not just a U.S. organization. It is an organization and a movement, but you have it all over the world in, I think, documented 40 or 50 different countries. And that really ramped up, and we see a lot of this, ramped up in the late 90s and early 2000s, wherein countries were also decriminalizing abortion. And so again, these marches go hand in hand with political developments that are progress for SRHR.
You point out that it was Donald Trump, the first sitting US president, who attended the march in 2020, and then it became a widespread movement that politicians around basically the world became part of these marches and this movement. Can you talk about the significance of that?
It gives this is the political legitimacy, not just of Trump, and this last march had Vice President Vance in person speaking. I think in other cases we've documented the former president of Poland and other high-level religious leaders as well in the Catholic Church and elsewhere who attend these marches and speak. Leaders of anti-rights organizations in Spain who also are part of these marches. It gives political legitimacy to these movements. And I think in the example that you stated around 2020, you had key figures of the anti-abortion movement in the US, key influencers, young influencers, subsequently in Washington meeting then with members of the government and the administration. So again, it's where that pipeline has moved from boots on the ground, political awakening, activism, the cause that drives young people, to access. Political access, influence access as part of that pipeline.
Can we just spend one moment? Because at this point, the listener may think, okay, why not politicians can have their own agenda and their own opinion and their own movement? Can we spend a moment we talk about anti-abortion? That can be, in principle, a personal view. But we talk about anti-abortion, anti-LGBTI, racism, migration. So can we just stop for a moment? Why is it actually problematic that politicians are involved in this movement?
I think some politicians would say there's no problem at all, unfortunately. And I think it gets to bottling down of what the anti-rights movement has said, and again, rather recently, is that there are only some human rights. That basically, after the 1950s, we expanded human rights too much, which is just a great erasure of not only LGBTQI or abortion or contraception access, but also of women writ large.
And the very, very principle of universality of human rights to all groups, regardless of race, age, gender, and all, right?
I mean, it gets to, again, on a personal level, organizationally with Ipas, we believe in the right to bodily autonomy. And if politicians are saying, you as an LGBTQI person don't exist, don't matter, or should be persecuted, that's a violation of those rights. If it's saying you don't have control over your reproductive health, whether that's, we have politicians who are denying those very rights writ large. So that's why I would say it's critical to have politicians who listened to WHO health guidelines and science and
And
What's that
treaties
about?
and constitutions and
Yeah.
human rights laws, right?
And again, unfortunately, it's not new. We focus on university students because, again, of the mobilization, the recruitment that happens through campuses that, especially in the U.S., that are quite large, easy to access. But whether it's about the anti-abortion movement or even about how you teach history, again, in the U.S., but it's not unique to anywhere, controlling young people and younger people, and we talk about children, is imperative for building infrastructure and like-minded future generations. Citizen Go, which is a Madrid-based anti-rights groups, they do a lot of petitions online and sign-up sheets. They're really, really active, not just in Europe, but in East Africa. And they work closely there with, just as an example, an organization called the Kenyan Christian Professionals Forum. And they specifically, this is not anything hidden, it's on their website, it's on Kenyan Christian Professionals website. They work with high school students, with secondary school students. And when you see their annual, they also participate in the March for Life. They organize it every year in Nairobi. You see young children in uniform. And again, that's not unique. You see that in Latin America, you see that in the US. Increasingly, you're seeing that in Europe. Another really unfortunate example is Turning Point, which is a US-based organization, but that now has chapters all over the world. In the UK, they train adolescent girls to be influencers online against abortion. So we're seeing this different use of young people through schools, through high schools, but also targeted social media to try to get younger and younger people as part of their movement.
Your next chapter, or the report's next chapter, is of the school and talking about what's happening on the campuses. And you talk about not only the US, but Uganda, Canada, UK, Ireland, Australia, Mexico. So how the campus-based, university, institutional-based influence of anti-rights, it's not just a slogan, anti-rights, it's actually anti-human rights. Messaging, education, how is it happening at the campuses?
Yeah, so we've talked a bit about how, there are campus groups. Students for Life is a campus group that's really well known and again has now Students for Life all in different campuses all across the world. We've talked a bit about Opus Dei, Tradition Family Property, a lot of these campus-focused groups that do their recruitment and have meetings and all of the rest in those spaces. I'll speak a little bit about the US, but then some examples that we've been seeing lately in Europe. And that's really funding legal education in the US. Major universities that now have law schools that are funded by, frankly, dark money, but also billionaires who have deep ties to highly influential anti-rights actors in the U.S. To speak about Leonard Leo, who's tied to some of the reason why we currently have the U.S. Supreme Court conservatives that we do is these same networks of billionaire philanthropy, links to groups, again, like Opus Dei and others. Also, you have that happening elsewhere, like I mentioned. While two of those organizations are now defunct because of changes in government, one in Poland, one in Hungary, they've been highly influential in, again, creating institutions for young people to try to form them around their values against LGBTQI, against migrants, like we've mentioned as well. It's not just anti-abortion. It's a variety of different things that's very white nationalist, anti-migrant, replacement theory, conspiracy theories. And so you've had those educational hubs often where there's an increase in far-right politicians. Unfortunately, some examples that are very current are from Spain and from France, where you now have, again, not just billionaire funding, some of that as well, but lots of investment by far-right parties in journalist academies and legal academies. Some of them are official and have graduate programs, but some of them are just more training centers. And they are following, to a certain extent, and they explicitly say so, molds that have been created in the US. So they're all learning from each other. And again, these networks are rather small of people. Unfortunately, they are following along these far-right political gains that we're seeing at the moment blooming everywhere.
Just to be concrete, you are giving two examples briefly. One of the Hillsdale College and the other one is Liberty University.
Yeah.
What these examples are showing?
So those are two U.S. examples. Hillsdale College is funded by billionaires that include, the DeVos family. Betsy DeVos was education secretary under the first Trump administration. And they also get funding. I mentioned Leonard Leo, ties to Opus Dei there, the Koch brothers. So massive amounts of funding for a very small university that is also pushing, and this is where we can pick apart all of these threads. Hillsdale University has ties to a program, an initiative that is for secondary schools, where they reteach a curriculum that denies slavery, that rewrites U.S. history into this white supremacist narrative. Hillsdale College is also very linked to UN advocacy that I mentioned at the beginning. They work quite closely with this Dutch-American group called Christian Council International and a U.S. group called the Center for Family and Human Rights, who are extremely vocal at the UN, at the Commission on the Status of Women. And they bring these interns and students from Liberty, from Hillsdale, and from elsewhere to provide them with opportunities for internship, to provide them to access to UN spaces. A lot of these groups that I mentioned work quite closely with specific UN missions, including the Holy See. So it's about giving young people access to these privileged spaces and giving them platforms as well.
And when you are talking about the shaping the far right's curricula in Europe, you are mentioning, Hungary now, there is a system change, and hopefully it will address these now deeply rooted problematic educational factors as well. But you mentioned already Spain and France and Poland, and talk about that, how it works with stipends and fellowships. And you mentioned the investment, especially in law students, medical students. Why does it matter to target specific disciplines like law and...
Yeah, so as we mentioned, we have some of these formal, semi-formal education spaces. In Poland, there was this Collegium Intermarium. In Hungary, things have changed, but there was the Matthias Corvinus Collegium, which also had a Brussels campus. So again, giving young people who are either in law programs or in sort of policy programs access to these privileged spaces to gain internships and work experience. So it's that work experience piece. Then to your point, you also invest in universities that provide medical training. We're at a moment where in the U.S., if you are denying the right to abortion, you're also working to deny the actual care and the experience of how to provide that care. So we are going to find ourselves potentially in either specific U.S. states, in other countries that are advancing anti-abortion initiatives, where there's going to be deserts of speciality on providing safe abortion care. And similarly, if you're investing in legal professionals who are working to undo rights, you're going to be further constricting those legal spaces. Also trainings for media and comms to be able to sell these narratives to not just current generations, but again, recruiting young people to speak to their own audiences, to craft that advocacy and policy language for wider people. So it's investing in different parts of society, essentially, in order to have a more unified anti-rights approach. And that is long-term and very much infrastructure-based.
And as I was reading your report, I kept reminding myself that it is what the democratic movement has been doing since the Second World War, right? Investing in professional education, providing scholarship. The big difference is that it was in the context of democracy. It is in the context of equality. It is in the context of human rights. And the problematic element is the enhancement of anti-rights ideology. This is the problem. That takes us to the next chapter about lifelong learners. when the report says that investing in education and student organizing is one of the first steps of indoctrinating young people. Once students are fully imbued with conservative values, the anti-rights movement is also there to provide professional opportunities, often accompanying them throughout their careers. Can you talk more about this?
Yeah, sure. And this is where, we talked a bit about formal education, semi-formal, continued training. There's training programs for not just what we would call anti-rights, but it's really ensuring that if you very much think of it as a pipeline, you're recruited at university, maybe even younger. You're provided with specific educational opportunities that are formalized, internships, and then you get to where you have potentially a young professional who can have further training programs that, again, if we looked at the spectrum of the actors involved, I mentioned this group, Christian Council International, that provides internships to Hillsdale students. In Europe, we've talked about Citizen Go a bit, which is linked to other far-right Spanish groups. No one group dominates these. They have different training programs, different academies that are tailored towards, again, we've talked about legal and others. So that's sort of this continuing accompaniment you see for the very young professional.
And this section also talks about, for example, Latin America, that what's happening and widespread in Latin America. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's even a more recent example from just late last month in July, where a group that we've been following for quite some time called the Political Network for Values, this organization, its president is was Jose Antonio Cast, who is now the president of Chile, the actual country. And so that organization, hugely networked politically around the world, also has a specific training program for young people that they do every year. And it's called Political Network for Values Youth. And it's especially linked to Latin American youth, but also with this link back to Spain. It's what they refer to as, Ibero-America, Spanish, and that Spanish connection. And so that's where you see these ties and all this learning between European groups and Latin American groups.
On page 39, you have a kind of graphic, what you call a multipolar ecosystem. What is this multipolar ecosystem?
Yeah, that was just an example of, again, using Spain, given specifically, we were looking at Fundación Disenso, which is founded by the Spanish far-right Vox Party. But that Vox Party also has its own think tanks and its own youth networks. And so that's where we were sort of mapping out the links between a political party, its think tank, its link to U.S. and other groups. We talk about the Heritage Foundation, which was, for those who are listening who aren't familiar with it, highly influential in the current U.S. administration's entire map for remaking America. But yeah, some of these groups are really pivotal nodes in the anti-rights ecosystem, given their longevity and, frankly, given who sits on their boards. There's so much overlap between some of these groups.
And how all of this linked to Africa, specifically to East Africa?
Again, we were talking about Fundación Disenso. We're talking about the Vox Party. It has its own think tank. One of its other arms is a group called the Hatzeoir, which is linked to Citizen Go, which I mentioned earlier as the link with the Kenyan Christian Professionals Forum. Citizen Go, again, is this digital platform for the most part, but they have activists who, I think they had staff in Kenya at one point, but they've also been really influential in Latin America. They actually send youth activists to the Organization of American States General Assembly that happens every year to, lobby against woke initiatives there. So it's a hugely influential group. And we actually have another report about Citizen Go that I'd be happy to talk about another time.
And also CFAM, yeah, and that links us to the UN, links back
Yes.
to the UN, and it's really important, and because all these localized movement are adding up to this network, and has an influence to global politics standards, then drives back to national politics and subnational politics. So can you talk about this globalized, how it leads up to the globalized influence?
Yeah, you mentioned CFAM, and I mentioned their full name earlier. It's the Center for Family and Human Rights. I mentioned them in the context of Hillsdale College. And I think if we go back about 30 years, a lot of the main anti-rights groups we think of, whether that's CFAM, whether that's Family Watch International, Political Network for Values, who I mentioned a little earlier, is a bit more recent. But a lot of these what we call the anti-rights group really came together following the 1990s and the expansion of global level rights, both in terms of sexual and reproductive health and rights, but the acknowledgement of LGBTQI people and protections. So you had this rise of, frankly, the opposition at the same time, who were in these UN spaces and just saying, we need to come together to oppose this expansion of rights. And those very same groups are the ones who are now recruiting and working with more and more young people. As I mentioned at the beginning, you see these young people in these spaces, and now they're very much the norm. They're extremely visible, and they have their own groups now. They're not just being invited by CFAM or by Christian Council International. They are the ones doing a lot of the anti-rights leadership in those UN spaces.
The influence is going, and you are mentioning two examples, the World Youth Alliance and Renthoven.
Yeah. I think the World Youth Alliance is a good example of what happens in sort of those UN spaces. They do a lot of regional advocacy training. Again, they're a youth organization that are deeply linked to some of these other groups we've talked about. So I think we can't say that they're sort of organic, created on their own. They're very much propped up and part of this ecosystem of the groups that we've talked about. But they do specifically UN human rights training for young people. They have scholarships, they have internships. They're very linked to traditional methods of family planning, shall we say, and they do a very good job of not being anti-modern contraception, but they promote the Billings method, and we've dug into them a bit. They work very much through official NGO channels. They have accreditation at the UN, and so they're very, very visible there. So that's just one example. The second one you mentioned, Renthoven, again, very timely because I mentioned Political Network for Values, and someone who came up through Renthoven in Argentina is now very prominent in Javier Milei's administration in Argentina. And he was just speaking at a Political Network for Values event. Renthoven, again, is a leading anti-rights NGO in Latin America. It has regular youth programs and a big mobilization event on an annual basis. And they are very connected now to politicians. As I mentioned, several of them are members of Javier Milei's inner circle and also within his government. And then they're also influential in global human rights spaces. There's an NGO that's based in Washington, D.C. that has ties. Both of the people who lead that NGO have ties to Renthoven. So they're working against the human rights system at that level as well.
And as your report points out, we are living in the social media age that is influencing politics, thinking, knowledge, even evidence, understanding science, how it's connected to social media.
You not only have these sort of established groups that have been around for 30 years, you do have legitimate youth-led organizations. We talked about World Youth Alliance. It's a bit more propped up. Some of them, again, have these ties, but some organizations, I'm thinking of Live Action, which was founded by Lila Rose, who has millions and millions of followers across different social media platforms. She started the organization when she was just in her teens. She's an anti-abortion advocate, but now she's plugged into all of these different networks that we've talked about and speaks on the global stage with far-right politicians at events. She's produced this Baby Olivia video, which is now being shown as comprehensive, as they wouldn't call it sexuality education. They would call it, I think, human development education. Her videos are now being shown in schools, and they are obviously anti-abortion, not scientifically accurate. They're extraordinarily problematic. But she's someone who has extraordinary reach to an audience that a lot of progressive organizations don't. And it's that what the anti-abortion movement has done so well is to capture the narrative of, to a certain extent, the social justice narrative. They talk about human rights of the fetus. They talk about gender justice in the womb. They've used all of these extraordinarily catchy phrases that just get replicated online in sound bites. And it's extraordinarily effective. And it's a great recruitment tool, again, for if we think back to university students and the rest, they are the ones using these same slogans. They even have them on their T-shirts. So it's that combination of now having this social media reach that is extremely influential, coupled with this political networking that's also happening with young anti-abortion and anti-LGBTQI rights leaders.
How is it linked to toxic masculinity?
This is where we get into, and in the report we touched a bit on this. We didn't. Others have gone much more into the manosphere. Now you also have the womanosphere. I talked a bit about earlier this group called Turning Point USA, which has been one of the proponents of traditional family, traditional gender roles, and that's where you get this melding of anti-science, anti-rights, traditional gender roles, the trad wife movement, and the pushing of these narratives that are anti-gender equality. And that's unfortunately being pushed also by younger and younger people online, and how that's all part of the same thread that we're seeing in terms of this investment and pipeline of the anti-rights groups. And it's just, social media is now a new tool that's being used to a certain extent by these groups, but also they're just benefiting from this ecosystem that perpetuates harmful gender norms, that is unfortunately deeply homophobic, anti-migrant, and that helps feed into the anti-rights cause.
So when we couldn't believe about the content of Project 2025, it's being right now implemented. And what we thought, how many years ago, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years ago, that it might be impossible, now is happening. What is next? What is in the pipeline, especially in the geographies outside of Europe, Latin America, and the US? How the rise of far-right parties and the anti-rights movement globally shapes and increases vulnerabilities of particular groups across the globe.
Yeah, this what next question, I think. I am American. I wrote this when I was based in the US. It is focused, this report was very much focused on the model that we see in the US of this youth recruitment. And I think if you even zoom out a little bit, it's just the networking of anti-rights groups that has been facilitated in the COVID period by everyone going online. And now social media is allowing to feed into this network. If we look at the rise of young far-right politicians across the world, from Latin America to the US to Europe and beyond, we're just seeing how interconnected these groups, what we call anti-rights groups, what we call the far-right, the political far-right, even specific parties, they're all linked now. They all speak at each other's events. Again, I was just thinking about this Political Network for Values event that took place last month. It also came on the heels of far-right presidential victories from Colombia to Peru. Again, we've talked about Chile, but all of these people congratulating each other and being in the same rooms as some of the anti-rights groups that we've talked about. So you have all this intermingling, and that's only going to continue, and it's only going to grow stronger with these electoral victories. Outside of, again, if we're looking at from like Latin America to Europe, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, we're seeing this sweep of anti-LGBTQI legislation, whether it's new legislation, whether it's reaffirming old colonial penal codes, but you are seeing this hardening of language around family, around tradition, around values. We started off this podcast talking about a group called Tradition Family Property. It's all the same old language, and it's being repurposed, but there is this hardening, and it is being accompanied by anti-rights groups that we've been talking about. They've been able to be in these policy spaces, to interact at the UN, to discuss how they want to frame human rights, how they want to frame sovereignty. And I think we're only going to, unfortunately, see that increase of aligned narratives at the moment. And I'm hopeful that there's also other progressive youth movements that we haven't talked about today. And unfortunately, we didn't go out. We looked at the bad in the report just because we're in a moment that it's so pervasive in policy spaces. And unfortunately, we're just kind of seeing that hardening of language, law, policy around these issues.
And we are living in the moment. What these analyses that your report present make us reflect on the democratic, the human rights space, the liberal movement. Where can we learn, develop, strategize differently? Where do we get the hope, the enthusiasm, the energy? I'm personally getting it from Hungary as well, showing that youth involvement, engaging the young, and engaging really the youth in politics, when they develop their own understanding of their own rights-based democratic movement, can make a difference politically. So what do we learn, and how do we want to move forward to hold up democracies and human rights universally?
Yeah, and one of the things I came away with from this report was, if we're calling, blanket the anti-rights movement, they don't invest in elections. Again, I'm thinking of the US, where you see big push by the Democrats, by the progressives around elections to try to bring in young people, to try to raise awareness. These groups that we've been talking about have been doing this for decades, if not the better part of a century, investing in infrastructure, educational programs, associations. It's a whole system and not just an event that happens every 4, 5, 7 years politically. I think we need to be thinking much more long-term with a vision of the world that we want, beyond just a human rights system that is universal, to really have a progressive counterpart to these narratives we are seeing in the manosphere, that we're seeing in terms of trad wives, that the right is very successfully selling to younger generations. To your point, from India to Kenya to Hungary, we're seeing youth movements where young people are demanding their rights, often based on economic justice. And I think that that's possibly language we need to be much more familiar with, to not just to talk about human rights language that is still seen as lofty and elitist, but about real solutions to not just the economic crises that we're seeing globally, but the climate crises, to really talk about these things much more holistically. And to your point, I think anyone could read this report and say, well, doesn't the left do the same thing? Don't we recruit? My pushback there would be, we want a world in where we're educating young people to think critically and to engage critically in issues, and to form their own opinions and their own values based on that. And I think that's where you see it happening organically with these protest movements, which give me hope that regardless of what we're talking about on a podcast or in capitals, like, young people are demanding their rights. And how can we also include in those narratives rights about bodily autonomy, rights about gender justice, to again have a more holistic, progressive view of the world that we want, and to be able to communicate that effectively and authentically.
Can we just briefly engage with the recommendations that the report is talking about? You talked about the movement building. Can you talk about the legal advocacy, the cultural spaces, the digital, and the other recommendations that you are closing the report with?
So again, I researched and wrote this report. We worked with a youth advocacy group who provided the foreword, who reviewed the recommendations and edited them quite heavily, which was great because I have ideas about what young people should have the right to, but they should be the one leading on this. And I think a couple of recommendations that I would pull based on the conversations I've had with both the reviewers of the report and others is I was in an advocacy meeting where the young person who was speaking about the report said, to a group of funders and governments, fund us like you want us to win. And that's such a heartbreaking call on one hand because it's so obvious, but we're also, and sorry to talk about another harmful moment, we're in a moment where official development assistance, U.S. funding, global health funding, funding writ large for human rights is constricting. I think part of our reimagining the world is funding young people ahead of traditional organizations to ensure that they are the face of this movement and that they are able to push for their rights and that we are supporting them. And we talked about the digital space, the manosphere, whether it's young people, whether it's gender justice advocates, LGBTQI activists, and the rest are facing huge amounts of harassment online. The face of those movements are often young people of color, young people from marginalized groups. So it's also providing protection for these movements to continue and funding that aspect of it. But there are also really key parts of the recommendations beyond just investment from the progressive sector, whether that's philanthropy or donor governments. But it's really about coming together in those multilateral spaces that we've talking about to protect norms, to protect democracy and policy response, and being bolder in the face of the Donald Trumps, of the Vladimir Putins, of these far-right parties that we're seeing increase, and being bolder in our language, because I have personally seen, and I know other advocates as well, the continue rolling back the line that we've been holding on SRHR, on abortion rights, on gender-based violence. Gender, the very word, is becoming under attack, and we need to find ways of holding that line. And part of that work has to be interfaith dialogue and bringing in progressive faith voices. This report wasn't to take aim at any faith, but it was just to highlight the language that has been used and how it's come up with specific faiths. And there are progressive actors that we really should be working with to counter a lot of the hate and the capture of scripture, of faith-based narratives, so that it doesn't just seem like a progressive leftist voice that is sort of on its own against faith. That's not what we're trying to do with this report either.
Can I just say that I also like the recommendation of engaging with fun, with culture, with art, with storytelling. There is a lot of restriction and censorship about digital media and the digital space. But we have the tools as well to counter the misinformation and disinformation and regain trust about science, evidence, and connecting it to reliable messaging, right?
And I think that's where we're also and we keep on talking about dangerous moments. We're also in a moment where there are these conversations, especially in Europe, around the Digital Services Act and about, protecting digital spaces so that they're free from hate speech, and the far right, these anti-rights groups, the U.S. government, are seeing that as an attack on the freedom of speech. And I think we have to be careful on the progressive side is young people, youth need spaces. They need the space to engage, to have fun, to talk to each other, and that's where critical thinking comes from. So how can we ensure that there are spaces for young people to have these conversations where they don't spiral into hate speech and the manosphere? This is where we need to be holding tech companies to account, but that we can ensure that there are spaces for people to engage, for young people to engage, and that where we as progressive groups, individuals, are also engaging in a way that speaks to that audience creatively, as you said, with fun, that talks about culture and that talks about all of these intersecting issues. Yeah, more broadly.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for this conversation. Please visit SRHM and Ipas website for this podcast recording and the blog and the report as well. Thank you so much, Jamie. Have a nice day.
Thank you so much, Eszter. Take care.
Thanks for joining us for this insightful conversation. Please check the show notes for a link to the SRHM Journal, which is available online and open access. Follow us on social media and sign up for our newsletter to receive notifications for new publications. If you're enjoying this podcast, please subscribe, give us a rating, or leave a review. Sharing evidence-based and rights-grounded knowledge is our passion, and it's also critical to support the advocacy and actions that need to be taken to improve SRHR for all. We would very much appreciate it. Thank you for supporting the SRHM podcast, which is produced by our staff. The music was composed by Tiber Christian and Salomon Beautond.